experience. We need action, and we need to be able to do stuff. So when we look at, I mean, actually some of the best conversations are when we go to the local forest garden, permaculture garden, and dig. You know, we go out and dig a hole in the ground, and then slowly the things emerge. So we have to have stuff for the head and for the heart and for the hands all at the same time, and it's this balance. And then I think you know, and I don't know how you experience this, but having gone through the heartbroken part, I mean, it doesn't really stop, but at least having an experience with it, it becomes easier to be there for others. So in a sense, I mean, I have my subject and my teaching and my knowledge, but you know, the real kind of deep work, I think you don't really need any degree for that. You just need to be a human being and to be there, and to be able to hold that space without all the cop outs that we tend to offer each other, actually, and stay with it. I'm staying with the trouble, as
I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. A magnificent letter from a father to a son in a predicament-laden world. Beauty and love when we need it most. Help me welcome Jeppe Graugaard. He's a Danish, very talented writer, teacher, and loving father. Jeppe Graugaard.
Absolutely fine, yeah.
All right, great. Would you help me by saying your name so I don't make some huge mistake in trying to pronounce?
Yeah, it's not easy, I have to say, for for English speaking people, but my name is Jeppe, and that's my first name. My surname is Graugaard, if you want to say it the Danish way. But I mean, I lived in the UK for about 10 years, so I've had people calling me all sorts of things, and that's fine. So
you've heard it all.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let me try. So Jeppe.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Graugaard.
Graugaard. Yeah.
Graugaard.
Okay. Yeah. The D is silent.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I hope my invitation was clear, that I just love your writing and to also hear you reading it. And it is deeply resonant with the work that I do in resourcing and supporting people who are brave enough to face the human-caused collapse of Earth and human systems. That's what I do. And I'm always looking for beauty wherever I can possibly find it. And I found your writing so beautiful. And what seemed to be so real, so truthful. I just first wanted to just thank you for it. You know, it's just such a gift to run across this kind of truth-telling and beauty together. And so let me just stop there and thank you.
Well, thank you for reading. It's always it always feels like a gift when someone comes across, something that is, in some senses, quite obscure writing in my world, at least. And
Yes.
with a lot of these things, I think it's easy to end up feeling alone. And when you put stuff out on the internet, you never know where it goes. So thank you for reading, and I
Mm-hmm.
appreciate your
Yeah.
words.
And I guess where I would like to go in this conversation is first, if you'd be kind enough to introduce us to yourself. I'd be so curious how you would like to be known, as just a self introduction. And if you would be willing to share, I will be, of course, putting links to your writing and the audio of this piece in the show notes here. But for people who haven't yet read it, to know what you do introduce yourself a little bit in the piece. I'd be curious if you would just introduce us to what you are, what life is like, and what you do for your living and what life is like. And I'd also just be curious what um, how life is showing up for you now. And what I mean by that is part of my body of work is a special focused series, and this interview will absolutely go into this special focused series, and that is called Take My Hand: Conscious Parenting in a Time of Stolen Dreams.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by, if you could map out how you experience the world, how you see the world, which is to me what you did so beautifully in your writing, I'd be so curious if you would share a little bit of how you see the world, how you engage the world. Now, I think it's roughly a year and a half or so after you wrote this piece. I'd be so curious what you're seeing now, how it affects you and your partner, your community, your creative, things that you do. So that's what I wanted to do in this particular conversation. So let me just stop there and remind you that the first question I asked, which was if you would just introduce yourself the way you'd like to be known, and start us on this path to find out a bit more about you, please.
Sure. Well, I'm a teacher
Mm-hmm.
for a living. I live and work at a folk high school in Ry in Denmark, and there's a little bit of a story to the folk high school movement here in Denmark, which is quite a particular institution. The school where I'm at is a place where between 20 to 25-year-old young people come to live and learn together for 4 or 5 months. And there are different subjects here. My subjects are focused around what's happening in the world, both ecologically and politically and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And philosophy, that sort of thing. There are no exams in folk high schools, so it's all my subjects. Is kind of stuff that there's no curriculum. I make it up.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so that's where I'm at right now, and the journey here was. I mean, I should probably begin with my master's in climate change, I guess, which I I studied about 10 years ago now.
Mm-hmm.
at university in England. And I mean, the thing that kind of there is a moment there in those studies, I think, and you know, we call it different things in this sort of side of life, whatever, the peak oil moment, or you know, just a moment when you wake up and realize that where things are going is towards a world that is radically different from the one we know.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, studying that master's degree was kind of I mean, I had a moment where I just sat with all these exponential graphs looking at the great acceleration and kind of becoming paralyzed and having a moment of complete nihilism and feeling like nothing made sense, and not leaving my bed for a couple of days, and crying a lot.
Yes.
And from there on, and I think all the people I speak to, and you, I mean, maybe you could tell me how this sounds to you and the people in your experience. But I think coming to terms with what's happening it's such a long process, you know, that, you know, 10 years is, I mean, I'm sure it'll be happening for me the next 10 years as well.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't really stop. Like at that point, I think I was actually, it was almost a bit too much. So I had to back off a bit, and I went away and did something else. I worked for a consultancy in London for a year, which I was doing stuff with climate change adaptation and stuff, but, you know, things where I didn't have to look at the kind of things that, you know, we all have to look at.
Yeah.
And then I was lucky enough that my master's degree led to a PhD study, which I was fortunate to find at that moment, a group called the Dark Mountain Project.
Sure.
Had been kind of taking off in the UK, and so I did my PhD with them, sort of, and so I kind of spent a couple of years, you know, going to festivals, talking to people, interviewing, kind of co-creating the stories that were emerging around that time of 2010, 11, 12, in the Dark Mountain Project and in the environmental movement in the UK, and had a lot of these kinds of conversations. And so I got my PhD and fell in love with Vanessa, my partner, and we moved to Berlin, and we lived there when I was finishing my PhD, and then she got pregnant, and life took over, and we were kind of in between, you know, healthcare systems, and ended up moving to Denmark, and that's what eventually led to me being here. So in terms of trying to answer your question of how I'd like to be, I don't know how I would describe myself. I mean, I have an interdisciplinary background, having studied politics, philosophy, and economics, and climate change, and then a PhD in environmental faculty. So so that's my kind of my academic background, but for a living, I'm a teacher and a researcher, and you know, my passion here, and what I try to bring to the school and the students here is this subject around global ecology and what is happening with the planet. So every semester I kind of radicalize myself a little bit by reading up on what's happening with you know, the ice and the oceans and the forests, and all of basically I'm trying in that subject to make global ecology, climate change, and tangible. A lot of, especially when you're like in the beginning of your 20s and you get into this subject, it's all it's not very concrete, and there's a lot of graphs, a lot of science, a lot of talk, and I try to make it kind of tangible, understandable in a sensual way, actually. So we do things like listening to the way that the sound of the planet is changing. I was fortunate enough to get to speak to interview Bernie Krause a couple of times, soundscape ecologist who basically a soundscape pioneer who kind of invented, is one of the founding fathers of soundscape ecology, and who has a very large archive of sounds of all around the planet. So we listen to how some of the places he's recorded have changed over the years, to try and get a sense of what climate change sounds like, and how the sound of nature has changed over the last 50 years. So so that's, yeah, we listen, we look, of course. It's kind of like an audiovisual tour around the planet. Maybe in addition to being a teacher and a researcher and a writer, I'm trying to get a hang of how do you introduce, how do you make kind of global change understandable on an individual level, and kind of designing courses through that. So that's what I'd like to do more of. In the future.
Oh, beautiful! Thank you so much. What a remarkable path you've been on. You know, it's since the beginning, roughly 7 years ago, of my deep dive into this work, I've had Dark Mountain Manifesto as one of the core manifestos that seems to be a foundation for any conversation that one wants to have in this arena. I'm curious, because you're a teacher in this field, it seems like you have a very special kind of well, it's obviously a special set of topics that you are introducing students to. But you also, I mean, my way of describing these topics is that this is the most important conversation in human history. This is unlike anything else that anyone has had to learn, much less come to terms with, like, how do I raise children? How do I communicate? How do I self-regulate? How do I bring myself back to some kind of internal state that's normal without normalizing global trauma? As it seems like what we're experiencing is eventually multiple layers of deep trauma. And you are in a role of introducing students to the entry level of this conversation. I'm curious, is any of that part of the language that you might use as you're putting together a course for these students? And I guess what I'm asking about in particular is this idea of how this topic will tend to dysregulate us. It would tend to take us out of a sense of feeling normal and feeling alive and connected and having a sense of humor and being able to engage with other people.
Yeah.
And when we're dysregulated, we don't have those skills, and we don't have that much of that ability left. So to me, there's a remarkable amount of this conversation that needs to also include some way of bringing ourselves back to wholeness, even after being knocked hard. So I'm wondering how that, if that sparks you to say anything.
Yeah, I mean, there's a real challenge in how to speak to the deep dysregulation, I think you call it, to the how do you speak to young people about this, about planetary change, whatever we call it, in a way that doesn't scare them. I mean, we all get scared, but I mean, that doesn't frighten them so much that they don't want to take my subject. Mm-hmm. Because you see, I mean, you can choose my kind of global ecology class, or you can choose music or theater or sleeping outside in a hammock. That's actually, you know, outdoor living is a subject here too. So it's an interesting kind of dilemma, because I have to attract students. So I can't go very deep in initially. Mm-hmm. But you know, once they're in the class, I find that more and more so, and I think I've been here for 4 years now, and just over the last 4 years, things are changing fast, mm-hmm. tremendously fast, and you know, the students who are coming here, more and more of them are wanting this kind of conversation, are really interested in it. Then there's a real, for me, the global ecology, that there is a certain amount of knowledge that one needs to have before we can go to the deep stuff, because unless you've been saddened or frightened or probably a little bit heartbroken by what's happening with the ice, what's happening with the oceans, what's happening to global biodiversity, you can't really delve in deep. Right. Before you've been a little bit heartbroken, your heart is not open enough, I think, to be willing to go deeper, because we have all sorts of, I mean, I'm sure you're an expert on this, but we have all sorts of psychological mechanisms to avoid looking at these things because they are traumatic. And you know, a lot of my students want action. They want to be able to do something. They want to be able to, so you know, I actually have to kind of, there are 2 modules in this class. One's where we look at the big picture, and then one's where we take the school's coffee grounds and put some mycelium in them and grow mushrooms. Mm-hmm. Or we make our own soap, or we go to the local eco-village and see how you build a straw bale house. We have to look at the alternatives, right? So it's this balance between going in deep enough that, you know, our heart's open, and then finding ways that we can keep thriving as human beings, because we need options, we need action, and we need to be able to do stuff. So when we look at, I mean, actually some of the best conversations are when we go to the local forest garden, permaculture garden, and dig. You know, we go out and dig a hole in the ground, and then slowly the things emerge. So mm-hmm. we have to have stuff for the head and for the heart and for the hands, all at the same time. And it's this balance. And then I think, you know, and I don't know how you experience this, but having gone through the heartbroken part, I mean, it doesn't really stop, but at least having an experience with it, it becomes easier to be there for others. So in a sense, I mean, I have my subject and my teaching and my knowledge, but you know, the real kind of deep work, I think you don't really need any degree for that. You just need to be a human being and to be there, and to be able to hold that that space without all the cop outs that we tend to offer each other, actually, and stay with it. I'm staying. I mean, staying with the trouble, as right, but yeah, it's really difficult, and sometimes, you know, I keep getting you know, when I wrote that thing with the you know, the conversation we need to have with our children about climate change, that was you know, just a couple of weeks after the 1.5 2 degrees report, and yet again being completely thrown by just how fast things are going, how big they are, and how horrible they are. And then, you know, having a little newborn there to show me and to teach me that you know, that now is all that matters, in a sense, and now is all we have, in a sense, and if we don't pay attention to what's going on now, we're going to miss all of the possibilities for change. And that's what I mean. I'm trying to kind of dedicating myself to my kids at the moment, because they're teaching me how to handle a lot of this just by how they are. And I think that, you know, the point in that text is that we need to change our being. It's not about you know, it's not just about changing ways of doing or thinking or whatever. It's actually changing ways of being, and we need to go that deep and to hold that space. I mean, in the Dark Mountain text and the community, there was an experience that you can't force anyone there. You need to. There's a sense that the Dark Mountain Manifesto was kind of like a flag that was raised, and it was like, hey, we're over here. Come and have this conversation if you're ready for it. And that experience of being in connection with other people who aren't just patting you on the back and saying like, don't worry, it'll be all right, but can actually stay with the difficulty.
Right.
That's the moment, that's the place where things open up. And how they unfold from there is there are so many ways in that, and how they unfold for each of us will be different, depending on our life circumstances. And some of what you're saying, if I can just say, that the realization that our lives are tied up with the destruction and with all of the difficulties is also, you need to take the long view, because we, for example, have just now, my daughter is a year and 5 months, and we've just put her into daycare, which was really difficult, and we don't really want to be honest, but we don't know what else to do. Our lives are like this. We can't, I mean, we have to work, we have to make things work. Eventually, hopefully, we can get to a place and find a way where we don't have to do this, but right now we have to. And that's really difficult. That's really difficult.
You know, I forget the exact words you just used a few moments ago. I think you said something like staying with the trouble. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm reminded when you said that of a recent conversation that I had with a futurist and a regenerative human systems designer named Joe Brewer. Are you familiar with Joe?
Joe, he's lives in the UK.
Joe Brewer from the USA.
From the U, I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
Okay. He's I think very much he's the kind of guy, if he was near your school, you would want to take your students to whatever he's doing. He's been very, very involved with uh, hands-on design and building alternative and regenerative ways for human beings to live with one another in their particular bioregion. And I find his the conversations with Joe are always amazing, and one of the questions that I recently asked him was, if you've got a person who's really wanting to do something differently, they're coming from the regular world, the business as usual world, and they want to, they're loving what you're talking about, they want to be engaged in creating a new regenerative way for human beings to live together, how could they prepare themselves inside to be effective? If they came in and wanted to contribute, what do they need to bring in terms of the inner skills?
Mm-hmm.
And he answered really quickly, and he said, self-regulation, advanced levels of that self-regulation that I was describing before, that ability to return ourselves to an optimal state inside,
Yeah.
and psychological flexibility.
Mm-hmm.
So we went on to talk about each of those and why they were important and so on. And just to speak again to the point I was trying to make before about the self-regulation part is, it seems like what you're dancing a remarkable dance with people, an improvisational dance. You're finding a way to bring them just enough of the information about the world and expose them to just enough of the truth of the world that they don't get freaked out, basically, that they aren't blown out of the conversation. They're so dysregulated they literally can't hold it.
Right.
So I really appreciate that you've got, a tough challenge there to walk that line or to make that balance happen.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like these are really times for a remarkable skill set for people to be functional, whether that's in alternative realities at the far edge of what's possible, like to be involved with a new community where you're doing permaculture and regenerative design. And I mean, that's some small number of people are going to be able to live in those experiments.
Mm-hmm.
But for the rest of us, it seems like this is really the skill set that we need to have, that I think you describe not only as a teacher, as you were just describing, you've got to walk that balancing line with your students, but it seems like you have the almost identical, but just a very slightly different, but similar balance to strike in raising your children. How do you expose them to how much of what's true and what's really going on, and when is it age appropriate? How much do you share? I mean, again, the art that you brought to your letter, just extraordinary. I'm curious if you would share any part of what that process has been like for you to decide how much to disclose, how much to share, how 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 much of the truth that you are very, very aware of can you share with your students, with your own children, with your spouse? with your friends and associates at school or community.
Mm.
I'm curious how you walk that line, and if you'd share any part of what comes up for you when I ask that.
Right. So yeah, it's it's difficult to share all of this. For example, with colleagues, I speak to my partner about this pretty much kind of on a daily basis, or at least it's something that is very much part of our approach to life. And with the students, it's very much I kind of know that space. I have I know the dance, as you call it, right? So it's always a matter of meeting them where they are, and depending on where they are, we can go different directions.
Mm-hmm.
With my kids, um, you know, so there's a project here I'm involved with, trying to kind of start up called Earthways, which is kind of an educational project, and the basic premise is, the Earth, nature has its ways. It's a reality that is there all the time. That's where we get our let's just call them laws of nature, even if they're kind of more like rules of thumb. But that's where reality lies. And so we've built we've been able to ignore that for a long time, and now we've made up all sorts of other rules, which are now collapsing. So which are now showing up that the consequences of ignoring all of our base, our foundation for any kind of notion of reality is catching up with us, and that's what climate change and breakdown of natural ecosystems is about, in a sense. So going back to the foundation, especially with my kids, is it's the only way I can see, and I don't really know how to do that very well, but I'm lucky that my son is only 4.5, so I can still kind of outwit him. But he's starting to ask difficult questions. So he said, why? What was it? Why can't I told him not to put some plastic thing in his mouth, and I don't eat that, basically. And he asked why. And it's trying to find an answer, saying, well, plastic isn't so good for living things. What's a living thing? I'm a living thing, you're a living thing, the birds outside, the trees, and so on. But there are also things that aren't living, like, for example, and I asked him that, and he said, like, well, what did he say? A house. So yeah, a house is not a living thing, at least not in the way that we were talking. And then kind of getting him to see, okay, so there's a difference between living things and non-living things, and plastic isn't good inside living things. So he's starting to get a sense of the basics, and I guess it's kind of finding ways to also for myself, just to kind of get back to the basics. And the thing that makes the difference for me, or what is absolutely necessary, I think, probably for most of us, is practicing that. Having a practice that allows us to touch that base of reality, whether it's body work. I have a very good friend, actually, who's been pivotal in my development, called Tony Diaz, an American guy who I met through my research, and we've been kind of talking and developing this conversation around more different themes, but practice is one of them. And kind of working with, you know, writing is kind of my practice. So that's where I try out try out things and try and find a way to articulate things. You know, I love hiking, walking, being in nature. Also doing a little bit of body work, you know, yoga, these kinds of things. Finding ways into touching reality and then practicing, because reality will I mean, it'll just bounce back at you and show you what's real and what's not. There was a time when actually I've been able to. It's funny with Tony. He's a friend I've had for about 10 years now, and he lives in the States, and we've been talking online all this time. And then I was able to invite him over some years ago, and he came over, and we were. I lived in a place where we were heating with firewood, and we were just, you know, outside chopping wood. And you know, in my kind of the way I am, I was just like chopping away, and then he like stopped me at one point and just made me notice the grain and the way that the tree is growing, and basically saying, look, when you have a straight line, it's much easier, and when they go across, then it's much more difficult because you're working against the tree, basically.
Yep.
I mean, is that sort of practice? I mean, I think, you know, chopping firewood could be a practice, you know. I mean, it's just a matter of exposing yourself to situations where reality will tell you what is what. So that's where I kind of get my reality check, and then trying to find ways to bring that to others and to bring that to my children is the game, in a sense. And in terms of what did you ask about? Exposing things. My experience as a teacher, and I kind of came into this from being in academia way too long, so I had to kind of get the hang of it. But you know, I think the best teaching, and that's also from being a student for a long time, the best teaching is basically the kind of teaching that gives you an experience of the matter at hand. So you have to not theorize it, but you have to have an experience of it, and then afterwards you can maybe reflect, and then you can start practicing. So it's like starting with experience and going to the base of reality, trying to touch the way that the earth is moving, is developing, the way that nature works, and then kind of like just where possible bracketing out, or it also requires like a lot of you know, just willingness to put yourself aside, basically, which can be very hard sometimes. Yeah, I mean, I get in the way of myself all the time. But what really helped me with this piece of writing, which is why we're talking, I guess, it was realizing that it's not about me. It's not about my future or whether I survive, or, you know, or it's about something much broader. It's about, well, it's about my children, of course, but it's about my children's children as well. You know, I love that view that indigenous people bring to looking at the world in terms of 7 generations, you know, forwards and backwards. And I think we in the West could learn a lot from that.
Yeah, beautiful. Beautiful. You know, it's when you were saying being able to put myself aside, you know, to get out of the way of direct experience is what I was hearing you describe. And I think you whether or not you meant to be saying this, I was hearing you say something very similar to that Joe Brewer comment that I said before, which was not only advanced self-regulation skills, but a psychological flexibility. And that's another way of saying being able to get ourselves out of the way. Because our psychology in the business as usual paradigm is, I think, is a toxic example of just how in the way we are.
Mm-hmm.
You know, as the average person, the average, you know, expression in this culture, especially in the States, is just a remarkable degree of both self-importance on the one hand and a grip on maintaining this ecocidal system.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got the two things together, and there's not much flexibility there. And
Yeah.
that's in the way of directly experiencing like you're describing.
Mm-hmm.
So what I was hearing in your particular way of saying it was getting it out of the way, getting those two elements and probably much more out of the way would allow us to start to directly experience, once again, what's it like to be directly connected with the web of life again,
Mm-hmm.
which, again, speaking for the primarily incredibly privileged cultures like the States, but really it's global now, it's everywhere, is what got us here is our disconnection from deeper self and from each other, obviously from earth and even from soul. And so what it seems like we're talking about is a, kind of the question that seemed behind what you were saying is, how can we open ourselves to being more, or at least basically reconnected with any of those elements?
Yeah.
And the only way I can see is to, like you said, get ourselves out of the way. What aspects of ourselves are maintaining that disconnection?
Mm-hmm.
And is there a way for us to set those elements aside and
Definitely.
allow that reconnection to occur? It's just my way of saying it. And I'm wondering if that sparks you to say anything yourself.
No, I just, yeah, I think I follow what you're saying, and I think to go to you know, to get out of the way, uh, it's very difficult. You know, you can go on a spiritual search, and you can go and try to dissolve your ego, and you know, find out then in the end that the searching and the trying is in the way, because that's what's creating your ego. That's what's holding on. That whole idea is part of the package. It's part of the double bind.
Mm-hmm.
So so the way I think is to go to the source of our experience, which is our attention. So so I'm teaching a course here at the school about attention. So you know, it's not called that. It's called something different. But we basically get together and try to be attentive uh, around 15 minutes at a time, doing
Mm.
different exercises with different themes. It can be next week we're gonna you know, be I'm gonna blindfold my students for 3 hours and be in a dark room and play ball games, touch objects, follow sounds, get a spatial awareness where you basically realize that, hey, our sight is focusing our attention in a very particular way. And we hang out in the sauna for a couple of hours and, you know, sing songs from the folk high school songbook for 15 minutes and get a sense of, hey, what happens to my attention when I'm very hot and singing the same song over and over. what happens to the attention in that state of frame of mind. We go outside, of course, and go into the woods and see what happens when we're in the woods. But basically having an experience that our attention in pretty much, I think it's an everyday experience for all of us, that our attention is stolen away. And you know, I mean, our attention has been commodified in a very real way. You know, the longer we are sucked into looking at some website or using a platform, whether it's Facebook or whatever, the more money someone makes. So the world is full of attention traps, and unless we kind of take back control of attention and get a sense that it matters where we put our attention, then we won't get very far. But once you start delving into attention, it's really interesting, because that's where the world deepens, right? That's where the experience of the world deepens. So if you're get good at just being quiet, then all of a sudden it gets easier to get out of the way, to get yourself out of the way, and just to be present with what's going on. And that, I mean, at least with the kind of cohort we have here, 20, 25-year-olds, that's a very, it's almost sometimes a bit like a revelation that, hey, I have a faculty called attention, and I should take care of it. But once you do that, that's where the interesting stuff starts happening. And all of a sudden is having attention. Like, for example, I asked them just very simple things. So the first exercise we do is, everyone in the class looks everyone else, we take turns, into the eyes and hold the gaze for 1 minute at a time. So we just sit there and look each other in the eyes for a minute, and then we do that with one person and go through all of them. And I would say this is almost like the biggest experience for them, because it very rarely happens. There is that wonderful performance art piece of what she called Abramovich, where she's sitting in MoMA, and basically just for a very long time, for days on end, looking people into the eyes, and people are queuing for this for hours and days to get to sit there and look someone else into the eyes. So when we start getting to grips with our attention, something also happens between us as human beings. We all of a sudden we can't ignore each other in the ways that we tend to do. So practice and attention, I think, are two. Just talking from a personal perspective, those are two key areas where I try to get better at being.
Yeah, wonderful. I think there's a direct overlap with the direction that I've headed in creating my own body of work. I'm so glad to be hearing your leaning on practices and also on what I might call the deployment of our attention. It just couldn't be more important these days. I think your students are extraordinarily lucky to have you. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I don't know. sometimes I also get that sense, but you never really know. Sometimes it's, and that's the sometimes the frustrating bit, because I would also like to get patted on the back and say, like, thumbs up, that was a good job, but you don't always get that, so you never know. And then sometimes people come back a year or two afterwards and said, like, whoa, that thing you did there was great, or that thing was really annoying, or whatever, and you get some sort of feedback, but often you don't. You just leave class and think, like, were they there? But yeah, that's just the way it is.
That is the way it is. Well said. You know, I know that our time is coming to a close, and there are quite a few different lines in your refiguring, um, in the letter that you wrote your son, that I'm inspired by. I wanted to bring up somehow, and again, I'll just include the writing and your audio version and links to that in the show notes for this podcast. But if I may, I'd like to just read one of the lines completely out of context, but I think it stands very strong on its own. And I'd like to read it and then ask you to share whatever you might want to share with people who won't have the opportunity to be your students. They don't live where you are. They, for any number of reasons, just won't end up being in your school. But if you had a way of sharing one final message to them, people who are so very interested in what you're describing sort of a bridge between the business as usual world in which life is compromised. It's not looking good. And you've for some time now, for really it's quite a long time, you've been involved with this the most important conversation in human history. And if you could share one last offering to these folks who want to find their own version of this bridge to some way of shifting the way of being that they're being in their life, whether they're a parent or not, whether, no matter what their occupation is, could you share some last offering to help them start to make their bridge? And so if I may, I'd just like to read this couple of lines and then just see what you were inspired to share. So again, this is from your Refiguring, Finding Humanity in an Age of Extinction, and a letter to your son. Cherish that grief as a gift that will let you remain human in the face of loss. Don't shy away from it. Hold it. Let it remind you that the fabric of this incredible universe is love. Despite all the violence today, this is the deep truth of existence. Because grief is love, and love is truth.
Yeah, I think I could maybe end with saying that just if things feel difficult to the point of unbearable, there is a value in trying to hold that, not as something you have to enter in any way, but holding it and looking at it, because in connection with what you just read, that is the other side of a coin, where you'll find beauty, as you've also talked about, and connectedness. And one of the paradoxes of this time, I think, is that it's actually a sign of sanity to feel upset. And it's very difficult to find places where that's appreciated. But I have a sense that connections are growing and communities are forming around this work, because it is work. And the unbearable part of it will pass. It might come back, but it's a long journey. And finding community is one of the most important tasks at hand at the moment, I think.
Yeah. Wow. So Jeppe, it's just been such a joy to meet you. And quite a while before that, it was such a gift to be able to read your writing, your letter to your son, which you generously shared with us in the public. And I would like to be so bold as to offer you a little bit of the acknowledgement that you mentioned before, that it would be nice if you were acknowledged from time to time. I would like you to know, Jeppe, that I see you. I see you. And so I'm deeply moved by your generous sharing of an extraordinary level of experiential wisdom, and your very open sharing of your relationship with your son, with your children, with your spouse, with obviously your students, and I can only imagine your community as well. And I don't know how, after the many, many conversations I have, very much like this one, I don't know how a person does it any better. I don't know how it would show up to do being a human being any better. I'm so moved and inspired. I wish I was roughly 25 years old and lived in Denmark. I know where I'd be spending my time. So I strongly applaud your continuing this work. Sounds like in some other ways as well, with the friend from the States, and sounds like you might be creating an expansion, hopefully, of what you're doing. I just want to thank you for doing the work that you do and bringing the presence that you bring in doing the work that you do and in living the way you live. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dean. It means a lot to hear that. And thank you for getting in touch and for starting this conversation in the first place.
Yeah.
And likewise, I appreciate what you're doing. I've been reading a little bit about it, and it sounds like the right thing.
We shall see, huh?
So thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Music today from Michael Hedges, as always, and also Port Blue Into the Sea. Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our every other Tuesday free support group
that we call Safe Circle Calls.